Okay, good morning, comrades. I would like to start the report by saying a few things about the place of the report in the session and about the place of the reporter in the session. To introduce myself a little. I understand in the first four reports you had, you've got background about Marxist economics, about women's oppression, some fundamentals. You've also touched, of course, on the crisis that we are in now. And with this report, I'm trying to move a bit from the questions of the crisis to questions of strategy. How do we respond to the crisis? How do we use the crisis to help overthrow capitalism? And this is also the first report that focuses on a specific region. But in this report, as in other reports, I hope, I want to use specific regional focuses to raise some general issues. So when we talk about permanent revolution, we can try to apply it to the Arab region. But of course, permanent revolution is a global strategy with global implications. So you could just as well have a report about permanent revolution in Latin America. So you can try to bear the global implications in mind as we talk about this specific region. So why am I giving this report? Well, I'm from the United States originally. So that, of course, has been for my whole lifetime and is still the center of world imperialism. So if you're a revolutionary in the United States, you have to focus on US imperialism. It's a specific importance for me that I worked on the Middle East, and that has something to do with the fact that I'm from a Jewish background. So that required me from when I was young to think about Zionism and have an analysis of Zionism, which is a central issue for the Arab region. You may not think this is relevant, but I think it's relevant that I'm gay, and I've been a gay activist as long as I've been a socialist activist and an imperialist activist. I think it relates to me because it helps explain the personal importance for me of anti-Zionism. Interesting things have been written to talk about the role of Zionism specifically in transforming Jewish men who were viewed historically as, in Europe, as not real men into real men. Warriors, pioneers, not people studying the holy books somewhere in a school somewhere and not working the land. And I realized at a certain point, as I became an anti-Zionist, that I am not a warrior and not a pioneer. And so that adds a personal element to my political anti-Zionism. And finally, for the last 20 years, I've been living in this country, in the Netherlands. I came here in 1993 to work in this institute as co-director and stayed here until 2006. And this has required me to deepen my understanding of European imperialism, or the different European imperialisms, Dutch imperialism, French imperialism, and so forth. And that, we will see, is also important for an understanding of the Arab region. Unfortunately, I have my limitations giving this report. For one thing, when you talk about imperialism, as I will explain, economics is crucial, and I'm not an economist. And it would be very useful to understand the region, to know the region in depth, and particularly to speak Arabic, but I don't. So I rely on other comrades who do, and trust in what they have taught me. So, how do I go back? Thank you. The report will consist of 5 sections. First, the basics of imperialism, Lenin's understanding of imperialism. Second, neoliberal globalization, the form taken by imperialism today. Third, armed globalization, that is the military side of imperialism today, and the so-called war on terror. And then fourth, the theory and strategy of permanent revolution. And fifth, the Arab revolutions today. And I hope to concentrate on parts 4 and 5. But that's a challenge, because that means I have to go quickly through parts 1, 2, and 3. So I will try to do that by leaving things out rather than talking too quickly. But if I talk too quickly, the reporter should please let me know so that everybody gets the whole report in all 3 languages. So, starting with the basics of Lenin's theory of imperialism. Lenin put forward his theory at the time of the First World War, and his basic thesis was that capitalism in his time had been through radical changes. That the capitalism of the time of the First World War was not, in some crucial respects, the same as the capitalism that Marx had studied in Capital. And the changes happened in response to Marx and Engels had tried to have some elementary understanding of imperialism, but they had never developed a general theory. They had focused on specific cases of imperial domination and national oppression. For example, in Ireland, where they championed the Irish freedom struggle against the British, in Poland, and in their analysis of French imperialism in Algeria and British imperialism in India. But they had never made this into a general theory. German social democracy, which was the main party of the Second International before the First World War, had tried to develop its understanding specifically of German imperialism, and had taken a principled position against its own imperialism with the slogan, "Not a man, not a penny for this system." So it was a crucial point for German social democracy always to vote against the military budget, for example. And that was supposed to be generalized across the Workers' International, so that all socialists, all revolutionaries imposed their own military states, their own imperialist states. But German social democracy also never agreed, never united on a coherent theory of imperialism. And their failure to agree had something to do with the growth of opportunism, of reformism, of revisionism, as it was called then, within German social democracy. And particularly the right wing of German social democracy, and the leadership of the trade unions in particular, became softer over time, more and more complicit with German colonialism, with the idea that that colonialism was, in a sense, good for the workers, and therefore to attack German capital abroad would hurt German workers, and you had to be careful about doing that. Still, it was a shock in 1914 when German imperialism entered the First World War, and the German Social Democrats unanimously in the German parliament voted war credits for the war, because they had always voted against the military budget. There had been this process of their becoming softer on imperialism, but it had not been clear internationally that this was happening. So to somebody like Lenin, for example, this was a big shock. And it required Lenin, it required revolutionaries internationally to deepen their understanding of imperialism as well as their understanding of reformism. So Lenin started from the assumption that capitalism had changed in fundamental ways that required theoretical development. He drew on what other socialists had been doing in the early 20th century, and he was looking at changes in capitalism essentially since the early 1870s. You had a period from the 1870s to the 1890s of what was called the Long Depression. It was a long recessive wave, a long crisis of capitalism. And in response to that, capitalism had restructured in fundamental ways. The rate of profit had been falling, as Marx in Capital had predicted it would. And in response, capital searched for new outlets, new places to invest, where it could earn higher rates of profit. And some sectors of capital found that, particularly outside the national boundaries of their capitalist states, found that in colonies. And this was linked to a process of what Marx had called concentration and centralization of capital. So the growth of monopoly capital as opposed to the old laissez-faire capitalism. And for Lenin, these two processes, the triumph of monopoly capital and the expansion of capital abroad, were closely linked, were part of the same process. So with this process of imperial expansion, the major imperialist states developed colonial empires, and alongside their formal empires, they developed spheres of influence in what were called semi-colonies, countries that were formally independent, but in fact economically dominated by particular imperialist states. So this gives you a certain sense of the condition of the world. In 1914, obviously you have the French Empire, and you have the British Empire. But because this is a bourgeois map, you don't see the full economic reality of imperialism here. So for example, South America was in fact essentially a set of British semi-colonies. British capital was dominant here. Or in Iran, it's divided between British and Russian spheres of influence. And China was carved up between different imperialist powers, each with their zones of control. This chart, again, gives a distorted picture. It shows that in the last quarter of the 19th century, formal colonization took place in Africa, but it doesn't show in Asia, it doesn't at all reflect the reality of the carving up of China, for example. And in the Americas, you would think that the influence of imperialism increased in this period, but again, that doesn't show the reality at all. It doesn't show the reality of the increase of British imperial investment and control in South America. We can see this a bit more clearly. This is a chart that Lenin used. If we look at the approximate distribution of foreign capital in different parts of the globe about 1910. And here we can see, so here, British investment in Latin America, for example, is reflected here. And you see very clearly British predominance in Latin America, there, much bigger than any other imperialist power. But you can also see the importance of imperialism within Europe. And this is all something else that shouldn't be forgotten. Here, if you look at France was, before 1914, the biggest imperialist investor within Europe, and particularly in Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia. The alliance, the military alliance between France and Russia reflected this reality. And this had something to do with the fact that the Bolshevik Revolution was a terrible blow to French imperial interests particularly, because French capital lost millions when it was expropriated in Russia. And here, this was also important for the outbreak of the First World War, because German capital was dominant in East Central Europe, throughout the Austro-Hungarian Empire and in the Balkans. So when Germany went to war, it was to defend these imperialist interests. So there we see more clearly the economic reality of imperialism before 1914. So to take the story quickly through several more decades, we can divide imperialist history after the First World War into three basic periods. The first period, you could say, is the struggle for the redivision of the world among the imperialist powers. You have rising imperialist powers, late imperialist powers, like the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, who challenged the dominant imperialist powers, Britain and France. Actually, the United States was also a rising imperialist power, a late imperialist power. It managed to triumph by allying with British and French imperialism, and at the same time flanking. The Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese, by the Second World War, tried a different tactic of going to war with Britain and France, and they lost. In the short. But this is essentially what the two world wars was about. This struggle for the redivision of the world among the imperialist powers. In a second period, the whole axis of world politics shifts. This is the period when the US is the uncontested dominant imperialist superpower, but anti-imperialist movements are on the rise. So this becomes a new focus of world politics. Anti-imperialist movements, for example, this is the period of the triumph of the Chinese Revolution. But you also have the rise of movements, populist movements, that are not revolutionary anti-capitalist movements, but that are fighting for more autonomy for their national states from imperialism. So, crucial in the Arab region, we have Nasserism. The Egyptian Revolution begins in 1952. In 1956, the Suez Canal, a crucial stake for British and French imperialism, is nationalized. And Egypt and Britain and France invade Egypt together with Israel to try to protect their investment. And they lose. So this is a blow to imperialism. And in 1955 at Bandung, the leaders of India, Indonesia, Egypt, and Yugoslavia come together to found what becomes the Non-Aligned Movement, which is an attempt to establish on a bourgeois or petty bourgeois basis an alternative pole to the main imperialist powers. And this is something that is important through this whole period, that imperialism is in different ways under threat, both from a series of anti-capitalist revolutions, because you have the Vietnamese Revolution, you have the Cuban Revolution, that are threatening imperialism, and at the same time, you have these populist regimes which are trying to establish a degree of autonomy from imperialism. And the US defeat in Vietnam is yet another defeat that makes imperialism look very weak. Finally, we have the third period, which begins with the installation of neoliberalism at the beginning of the 1980s. And this, Gilbert Achcar, who seems to be a fan of the Star Wars films, uses the expression, "the Empire Strikes Back," to describe what happened in the world in the 1980s, 1990s, and the beginning of the 21st century. So this is both an economic and a military counteroffensive. The acceleration of the arms race with the Soviet Union contributes to is one contributing factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc and capitalist expansion into Eastern Europe. The US relies on Islamic fundamentalism to resist the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan and save Afghanistan for imperialism. Economically, starting with the US and Britain, imperialism challenges the autonomy of Latin American, Asian, and African governments, and leading in 1982 to the outbreak of the debt crisis, which becomes a mechanism essentially for the recolonization of a vast part of the world, the economic recolonization, this time through the international financial institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So, this brings us to neoliberal globalization. In the reading, the text by Claudio Katz talks about the essential continuities between the classical imperialism that Lenin analyzed and the neoliberal globalization we have been living with since the early 1980s. So Katz argues that in several ways, imperialism, the theory of imperialism, is still a relevant framework for analyzing the world economy today in the age of neoliberal globalization. And he points to several things. First, the continuing growth of inequality. Bourgeois economists try to obscure this, but the world continues to get more and more unequal. And mostly, the rich countries get richer, and the poor countries get poorer. But inequality within countries has also accelerated even more. So that the rich within poorer countries, or what are called middle-income countries, have also gotten vastly richer in this period. Katz also talks about the way the terms of trade are used to extract wealth from poor countries and import that wealth to rich countries. So when multinational corporations invest in poor countries, they take many of their profits out and spend them in rich countries. So this is a constant transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. Debt is another mechanism for the transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. So what on the screen is called the extraction of financial resources. And finally, in the period beginning in the early 1980s with the debt crisis, you had a loss of political autonomy for the dependent countries as policies, budget policies, economic policies, social policies were all dictated from outside by the International Monetary Fund, by the World Bank, by the World Trade Organization. You can see the consequences of this in a few charts. these are fairly recent figures, 2005. And you have to remember, the dependent countries here include all the famous emerging economies, the BRICS. China, India, Brazil, they're all in there, in the 80% of the world population that's counted as dependent countries, and all together, these countries in 2005 accounted for 19% of world GDP. That gives a sense of how poor even the richest of the poor countries still are in this period. These figures give some sense. These are somewhat less up to date, so this situation has changed a little, but nonetheless, just in the period from 1998 to 2002, you can see 334 billion US dollars were transferred from poor countries to rich countries by multinational corporations. And in the 1980s and 1990s, you had deteriorating terms of trade for the poor countries. So that meant what you produced as a poor country, say, Mali growing cotton, and buying a machine you needed to harvest cotton from France. Well, in 2002, roughly, Mali had to grow twice as much cotton as before, as in 1980, in order to buy the same machine, because the prices had moved to the disadvantage of the poor. This has changed a little, but not, it hasn't all been undone since then. Okay, this is always a good chart, because it shows the relative wealth of countries and of multinational corporations. And you can see the very richest, the biggest economies in the world are bigger than any single corporation. But most countries in the world have smaller economies than the big multinationals. Just to make a few points about what you can get from this chart. Again, for all the talk about China being the rising power and coming to rule the world, still, last year, China's total economy was half the size of the United States economy, and of course China has 4 times the population of the United States. So that means each Chinese person accounts for roughly 1/8 the amount that a person in the United States accounts for, rich and poor, adult and children. You can make other comparisons. For example, India and Spain. So India has been growing. 2 years ago, and Spain, of course, has been in crisis, as we know, the Spanish state. So 2 years ago, the economy of the Spanish state was still bigger than the whole of the Indian economy. Now that has changed. But still, look at the relationship. The Indian economy is still not that much bigger than the economy of the Spanish state. And India has, 25 times the population of the Spanish state. So what does that mean for the relative wealth of a person in India, and particularly the relative wealth of Indian capital as compared to Spanish state capital? Or you can look at Egypt and Israel. Egypt's population is well over 10 times as big as the Israeli population. And of course, the Israeli economy continues to grow, whereas Egypt is in crisis. So this difference continues to grow. And if we look on the side of the multinational corporations, it's interesting to see whatever changes there have been in the world economy, of the 10 biggest multinational corporations in the world at the moment, 6 of them are oil companies, and 2 of them are car companies. So this suggests the continuing importance of this very ecologically unfriendly nexus of oil extraction and car production. And it says something about the relationship of forces in the world. Look at the size of the Iraqi economy. Iraq is one of the world's major oil-producing countries in the world, fourth, fifth, something like that. And then look at the size of the oil multinationals. The Iraqi company, the whole of the Iraqi economy, including, of course, the revenues that come to Iraq from the oil, is smaller than any of the 6 biggest oil multinationals in the world. So 6 oil multinationals are bigger than the whole of the Iraqi economy, where the oil is. So that says something about imperialism. Now, there are complicated discussions today about the relative position of some dependent countries relative to imperialism. And this is, again, the whole discussion of the BRICS, the rise of China, of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, a series of emerging countries. And the question of to what extent this has changed the relationship of forces. So, there are whole discussions, for example, about how votes are distributed in the international financial institutions that essentially run the world economy. The essential rule in the IMF and the World Bank is $1, one vote. So you see, we saw how many dollars are controlled by imperialist countries as opposed to how many dollars are controlled by dependent countries. This means the international financial institutions are still dominated by imperialism. Lately, there has been a sense that China, for example, and India have got to be integrated more into these institutions so that they can, too, play a responsible role in managing the world economy. So there are little shifts of votes. Belgium and the Netherlands now have to share a seat in the boards of the IMF and the World Bank so that a bit more room can be made for China and India. But this doesn't change the fundamental underlying relationship of imperialist domination. There have also been some shifts about the power of these institutions over some dependent countries. In the 1980s and the 1990s, almost all dependent countries were so deeply in debt and so dependent on the international financial institutions that essentially they have no economic independence at all. They had, within a capitalist framework, assuming they weren't going to have anti-capitalist revolutions, they had no choice but to do whatever the IMF and the World Bank said. And this became ludicrous at certain points when people read the budgets of particular countries and found out that the language was identical to the language of the budgets of other dependent countries because the same person at the World Bank or the IMF had written the budget. So they just took it over whole. Since that period, countries like Brazil have come up in relative terms and have paid off a lot of their debt and therefore have a bigger margin for maneuver, somewhat more economic autonomy. So the conditionalities are not as strong for all countries as they used to be. And this has some consequences. The fact that the Lula government in Brazil today, for example, can have a large-scale transfer payment to the Brazilian poor, which has made a lot of poor people in Brazil somewhat less poor than they were 10 years ago. This has something to do with Brazil's relatively greater autonomy from the international financial institutions. because the IMF would never have permitted this if it had been up to the IMF. But Lula could do it because Brazil has more autonomy today. But if we look at the international negotiations that go on, we can see that there are still big limits to this thing. Of course, even with high growth rates in many sub-Saharan countries, those countries are still extremely dependent. But even if you look at the most prosperous, the largest dependent country economies, you can see the limits to the autonomy they have even today. And to give two examples, one, the process of negotiating a new international trade agreement has been stalled for over a decade. The World Trade Organization negotiations happen in rounds, and we are still in and have for a long time been in what's called the Doha round. Each of these rounds is supposed to break open the economies of the dependent countries more, force them to buy more products from imperialist countries, to lower their barriers to protect their own economies. And this process has been stalled because particularly India, South Africa, Brazil have refused to accept the latest demands of Europe and the United States. But the process continues, and clearly there is not a united front that's unbreakable. India and South Africa, as governments, cannot be counted on to protect Mali and Bolivia if India and South Africa can get deals with imperialism that are in their particular capitalist class's interest. So that is a constant struggle, a big thing that's at stake. And another example that shows the interesting dynamics is in Latin America, there has been a project that has been underway for several years to create something called Banco Senior, which would be a regional development bank that would provide all these countries with an alternative to the World Bank, to fund development, to fund investment. But it doesn't happen. And why doesn't it happen? Because there is a process of negotiation between Venezuela, Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, and Brazil and Venezuela do not at all take the same positions in those negotiations. So they can't agree on the resources of the bank, the decisions that will be made on the bank. And as long as there's no agreement, as long as there's no united front among the dependent countries in Latin America, the supremacy of the World Bank remains unchallenged. So that concludes the second part, and I think this is autonomy makes sense to do.